Right, Rita, what's your full name?
Well, I was born and christened Marguerite Christine Welsh.
Swanky.
Very swanky.
And the names of your parents?
My mother was Johnny Kavanagh from the Castle House in Castle Street. That was the original house, not the one that's way gone for years and years. And my father was William Wally Welsh from Grace's Lane originally, and then Phillip Street, I think.
And your father, what was his job? What did he want?
He, in later life, by the time I came along, he was actually a builder. But prior to that, he had worked in London on the rebuilding of London after the Blitz, where everybody went to work in those times. I mean, I'm talking about the 40s and early 50s. But while he was there, he got involved in block laying and whatever, and he came back. And then he started, Denny's was being built at the time where the hypermarket is now. And he got a job there. So he did a bit of block laying, but then he went on to plaster it. So, So he did well, considering, but now when I say he did well, if you were to ask me what my life was like, it was pretty privileged in the sense that he was always working, but I'm very aware that at the time there was an awful lot of poverty.
He was one of the lucky ones.
He was, and he loved work.
There's a great line in the song, Rita, about it, about London and about all the Irish navvies over there. For every man that finds fortune and comes home to tell of the tale, each morning the Broadway's crowded with many the thousands who fail.
That's true.
Isn't
and
it
those
brilliant?
are the ones we never hear about.
The ones we never hear about. Your grandparents, by the way, did your mother work too?
No, my mother never worked, and it's something I think that she had a huge complex about.
Okay.
She was the eldest girl of 11 children, but she was actually the first daughter, so she would have had 5 older brothers by the time she was born, and her job purely and simply was to be the eldest girl
and to look after
everybody. And I think in a sense it was kind of like the handmaid. And her mother died then when she was quite young. She was 15, and she in those days had to make a promise to her mother she would take care of all her brothers and sisters, and so that's what she did. And I think going through life, and she would hear about people like her peers at the time who'd worked maybe in places like the Bulb Factory, from what I can remember, and Willie Watts and places like that. And she would always say, I'd love to have had a job. And I never got much schooling, but I met the scholars on the way home. So that's how she dealt with it. You know, but
my father was kind of in that category in relation to education. He used to always say to me about some fella who was a bank manager, ended up a bank manager. I used to do his exercise for him, he said. You know, and it was the same, and he was sort of a frustrated scholar, and like we had loads of books at home in Dial Street, educational books at home, and those, so I can identify with that,
But she kind of carried that chip forever through her life, and at times she'd get frustrated with us if we weren't, if she thought we weren't doing things we should have been doing with our lives, and she would say, well, what did I educate you for? Because for her, actually, education was simply the epitome of all things that you could have achieved.
Brilliant. Your grandparents?
My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, was Hannah Foley from Piltown. All her family worked in the Grand Gates, gardeners and housekeepers and whatever. But she came to Waterford, and I think she worked as a housekeeper up in Newtown School. And she met my grandfather, who was William Kavanagh, originally from in Chicago, I believe, signwriter. So they married, and on my paternal side, my grandmother was Ellen Durney, and would have been one of the Keneallys, you know, with the grain stores years ago, but the poorer side, they ran away with the groom. And she married, I think it's Michael Durney, and that's, and what is it? And then his grandmother married Welsh, that's right.
Were you born at home or in the hospital?
Born at home in Grace's Lane, I believe, and my mother said she could have knitted a jumper when she was waiting for me to be born. So It's amazing the stories that you hear that are attached to your birth or your name.
Yeah.
You know, as a child, and you think, God, was I even wanted?
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
It's the same. I met a woman one day, and she had her son the same day as my mother had me, right, down on Parliament Street. And she said, you bald, you little bastard, you bald. She said, for days and days, no one could get asleep with you. So that was her memory of me. So then you were saying, Rita, you were in Grace then, but you moved quite early.
Moved then. I was a year old, I think, and we moved up to Osram Street where the houses had just been built. That's as it was well known as the Narrow Lane.
Yeah.
But the Narrow Lane was in 3 sections. There was the first part that went as far as Rathfadden.
Okay.
Then there was the second part that went as far as Dominic Street and Congress Place.
Yeah.
And then the upper part stopped at the Mount St. Pitch.
Yeah.
So we were in the middle part. And we lived actually next door to the Dwans. There was 12 of them. And that's growing up was wonderful because we had the Mount St. Pitch at the top of the road. That was our playground.
How many were in your family?
8. There was 3 boys and 5 girls.
And how many rooms were in your house?
3 bedrooms, bathroom, a living room, and a scullery.
Oh my God! Yeah, you were the top of the top of the town. Oh yeah. And did you have a bed of your own?
Absolutely not. No, I mean there were 5 girls, so 4 girls slept in one double bed. 2 at the top and 2 at the bottom, and of course the row was always it's my turn to sleep at the top.
Yeah.
And it was handed down through a rank, but there were 4 of us. I was the second of the 4, and then there was the 2 smaller ones and my older one. So we always called rank and said, well, you're the smaller ones and we're bigger, so we need more space at the top. And then my older sister Joan, who was already working over in Clover Meads, she needed a night's sleep, so she had a separate little bed in the room to make sure that she got her sleep, so she could go to work. The 3 boys shared the same bed, and my cousin was pretty much reared with us, Dan O'Kelly, so that was 4 of them, non-stop fighting, and arguing, and my mother and father then in the other room, and my father was spending the night shouting at us, or shouting at the boys actually. God's sake, go to sleep and tell Dan O'Kelly you're going home to your mother tomorrow, which never happened.
I know, of course. Yeah, it's. I know that people go for in the future will say, "What in the hell?" You know.
How did they do that? Unhygienic was that? And how abnormal was it?
But it was normal.
Well, it was the only way.
It's the only way you could get a sleep.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So did you? Yeah, an inside or outside toilet?
Inside.
Of course, there were the new houses, right?
There were the new houses, yeah.
And the water, I presume, was inside.
Water was inside.
Now, did you have a bathroom in those houses?
We did, full bathroom.
Yeah. God, you were very swanky. I never had the luxury of any of those.
Well, my brothers certainly thought, and my older sister, when we moved in, apparently, they thought they were living in a mansion.
Yeah.
But I was too young. I mean, it was all I knew then. I was only a year old.
Where did you go to school initially?
Initially I went to the presentation, up to 6th class, and after that I went to boarding school. Now my father, I have to say, had started to make, a good living, and it was around the time when people were allowed to buy out their own, the corporation houses.
Oh, right, yeah.
And everybody started to build back kitchens and little add-ons and whatever. And he was doing an awful lot of that.
Right.
So my mother had this notion about education, but my father actually said he didn't really mind the fact, or he wanted the boys to have a trade, so they all worked with him. But he thought it was important that we would learn something, because the time was coming and there was no free second level education up until 1967.
Well, fair play to him. Like most working class people, would have been like I was told when I was 16, right by it's time for you to go to work. Yeah. And girls probably would have been even working even earlier, like in Willie Watts and those places. So like fair play to him. Like.
Yeah, he was far seeing.
Very much so, very much. Now, as a child, did you play games? And what games would you play? Could you recall any of the games you played?
I can recall playing beddies.
Yeah.
With a piece of chalk.
Yeah.
and chalk was very, very important in those days, and trying to get a few pence to buy chalk and making the squares on the street, and people coming along with, as we call them, tanzans and prams, and rolling over it and wiping out the chalk, and you'd be trying to put it back together again. And we played knocks, and we used to get them from the foundry. By God, they were heavy. But like, they were great skills and dexterity. Now when I think back on it, how we were able to do it, playing ball against the wall. Again, learning your coordination. Like, we would have coordination then that young people certainly would not have now, between looking at screens and watching television.
That's very, very true.
Like, we were able to do stuff with our bodies and move in a way that I don't see young children doing today.
It was all, like you say, playing handball and even beddies. It was all exercise.
And skipping rope and rhythm, learning to go through the motions of the rope. They were all skills.
Did you play any sports like hockey or?
In school I did.
You played hockey?
I played volleyball, tennis, camogie, and hockey. A little bit of hockey.
Now, when you were young, Rita, can you remember Christmas?
I can, very much. I remember the build-up to Christmas, about November. This was actually before I went away to boarding school. My mother would send me downtown every day. I'd have a glove, and she'd put whatever amount of money I'd have to spend or do the messages
on the inside of the glove.
On the inside of the glove, and 2 shillings to Herdens off the book, and then up to Sloane's and pay 1 6pence or whatever, and to tell Mr. Leamy to start putting away the shirts for Christmas, because everybody got a shirt. And I always remember the drip dry shirts had come in, and they were a lifesaver for my mother, because my father would only wear white shirts going to work under his overalls. And the idea of being able to hang a shirt out on the line and it was dry in an hour if the weather was nice. But ordering all these boxes of shirts for her, then up Patrick Street and into Mr. Rellis, they had a little library, and get her books. And I was only allowed...
Where was that now? In Patrick Street?
In Patrick Street. No, sorry, on Ballybricken.
Oh, Ballybricken. Oh, it's still the same shop,
Same shop.
On the corner of the lane
next to the church,
yeah.
And to get anything by Sailing Conway or Mary Walker or Lucy Burchell, I can still remember. And her number was 33A. And I wouldn't have been any older than maybe 10, 11 max. I'm going through the books. I'm going down to scrolling down looking for 33A, and if it wasn't on it, I was made. But I remember at one point, there were all the books, she read them all. And I said to Mr. Ellis, what will I do? I can't go home with no book. So he found one and he said, look, that goes back, that's 2 years ago. He said, bring that home, she'll have forgotten that. And I brought it home, and she said, I read that before, she said. And I said, Mr. Ellis, I said that you might forget it. I'm not giving him 6pence now, she said, to tell me that what I should and shouldn't read. Bring that back to him now, she said, and tell him to get me something else. So all those, they were skills.
Yeah, well, isn't it amazing, really, you said about your mother giving you the money? And the responsibility that was given to the children. Because I remember a neighbour of mine told me that she had a baby out in May Park, and the baby had died. And my mother was only a young girl and walked from Dial Street with a wicker basket out to May Park, took the body of the dead baby, walked back to Dial Street to give it to the husband for him to bury it. Now, that's the point I'm making, like, even though it was completely different, but it was a responsibility that was given to kids, and knowing that they carry out that task.
Absolutely. But it didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary for us. Like, these were our jobs. When we came home from school, my sister was cleaning the bathroom, someone else had to do something else. I was quite happy to get out. And go down to Maggie Wife's and order the jiggy chops for my father, because they had to be boiled, and telling him the story, because Mary said they have to be boiled because he has an ulcer. Well, if I hear any more about Wally Welsh's ulcer, he said I'd have to close the shop.
Talking about the jigger chops, what kind of food would you typically have eaten, Rita?
Well, we always had fish on Friday.
Okay.
Most definitely, because that was the church teaching. We would have tripe on a Tuesday.
Lovely.
My father would have drisheen. Wouldn't stick it. We might have the leftovers of a bit of chicken or a roast on Monday. And maybe what you call backbones or chucks stew, an awful stew, at least twice a week, and much more often in the winter time.
Right. So would you have had eggs in that? Can you remember?
We would have a fry on a Saturday for our tea, but we never got an egg. We got an egg. We didn't get a rasher. Got sausages but the men all got rashers because they were all working. But my father would cut up the rashers and he'd divide them out among us. But it never occurred to us that we should ask, can we have a rasher, or why haven't we a rasher? Or it just didn't seem to be an issue. Nor was there any. I never remember saying to my mother, I wouldn't like that, or I don't want it. I can't remember. I mean, I must have eaten everything.
Well, I mean, like, I remember my mother had a great saying, because I hated stews. I didn't like meat. I would never eat off it. I wouldn't eat it. And my mother said to me, well, you need it tomorrow because you won't get it. So, what was your first job?
My first real job was in the office in Arkeen. I just finished my secretarial course with Mother Eucharia, and she would get notifications in from people who were looking for girls who were qualified. So she sent me out, and it was for the summer. I worked for the summer, and then I finished and I went for an interview for the Bank of Ireland in College Green, and I started the end of that September, 1968.
Right. That must have been some culture shock for you, was it?
Huge, absolutely huge. And where do you stay in Dublin? And I stayed up in Henrietta Street, which is on the north side, in a girls' hostel.
Oh, right.
For about maybe 5 or 6 months, until I made friends in work with girls who maybe started around the same time as me. And actually one of them would have been Jackie Howland, who would have been, what's his name?
Brendan
Howland's sister.
Oh, right. The Labour man.
The Labour man.
Yeah.
So we eventually then got a flat together in Rathgar.
Excellent. So but again, getting back to your educational thing, you had foresight of your father and mother really stood to you.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I wouldn't have known it then. I wouldn't have seen that it was kind of prophetic. Which it was.
Yeah. Indeed. Do you remember how much you got paid?
I do. I got 28 pounds a month.
A month?
A month.
And what would your rent have been? Would it have been?
It probably would have been about £4. Then we had electricity, food, travel, we had uniforms, but we had to pay for them.
Could you buy uniforms?
We had to buy uniforms.
Yeah.
And those kind of costs, travel in and out to whatever, and socialisation cost a fortune.
Yeah.
Being able to go out.
But did you say to me earlier, were you offered a place in Trinity?
Yeah, when I did my leaving cert, I got 93% in Latin, which they maintained was one of the highest ever. And on the basis of that, I was offered what was known as a desk in Trinity College to study medicine. Now there wasn't any funding with it. I mean, in those days there were no grants. People went to college if they had the money to pay for that, or you could have worked towards a scholarship. But nobody had actually mentioned to me in school that maybe it was an option, so it didn't happen. But I had 2 younger sisters still in boarding school, so really it wasn't a runner. And it didn't actually kind of. I didn't feel deprived because of it, and I didn't feel I've been hard done by. I got on with it. But having said that, like in those years, we would have learned our lot was our lot. And wherever you were in life was sort of that's it. We weren't demanding.
For a working class girl, I mean, it was some achievement, and to actually achieve that. And I know there are some people get it, but I wouldn't know anyone at all that would ever have done that. I don't know anyone. So I mean, like it is an achievement you should be proud of. Your education achievement at that young age.
Yeah, and we came out of school with the gold fáine because everything was in Irish. Our subjects and our and obviously we spoke in Irish non-stop all day. Well, of course in the dormitory we did our own thing. But and looking back at it, as I got older then, I began to realise the value of it, particularly when I was separated. Yeah. And I thought, which direction should I take my life in? Yeah. And I kind of sat back and looked at my options. The difficulty was that wherever I went, I was told I was overqualified, which made no sense to me whatsoever. Yeah. You know, I had actually fallen between the cracks. Yeah, I understand it. Yeah. I understand perfectly about that, you know. And the other side of that, then, there are people who are self-educated, and because they don't have a degree, they're not qualified. That's true. So there's two sides of it, you know, and I understand that. But it's look, Rita, did you ever drink alcohol? I did. Right. What was your favourite tip, or what age did you start it? I started actually in the Majestic in Tramore when I left school, and it was the place to go on Saturday night and have a glass of lager and lime before we went over to the Atlantic Ballroom. Yeah. And sure, delighted with ourselves and full of sophistication. But I do remember actually at that time when people talking about G&Ts, and I thought it was a car, right? Yeah. And people saying, I'm going to have a G&T. I said, well, what is a G&T? And said, it's a gin and tonic. I said, I think I'll have one of those. I was in bed for 2 days. I was so sick, and it was so easy to drink, of course. You know, I think I had about 8 of them. Sure, I don't know. I think somebody had to bring me home in a car, and my mother wouldn't let me out again then for about a week. So the memories around G&Ts now are not very happy ones, I can assure you. And what did you have favourite bands at the time or anything like that? That you go to see, say, in the Atlantic or in the Olympia or wherever? Oh, sure, the Royal had to be the number one, without a doubt. And Butchmore, Dickie Rock, of course the Blue Aces or the Black Aces, what were they? The Blue Aces. The Blue Aces, yeah, they were local. They were local. Yeah. And we used to go to the tennis club then occasionally on Saturday night. Pat Comerford. Oh, Pat, Pat is still going. Yeah. Pat is still going. Yeah. But and of course my favourite music, and always will be to this day, are the Beatles. I was an absolute and utter Beatle fan. I don't ever met anyone who didn't like the Beatles music. You know. Yeah. So I mean, you would be trying to pass the time, or would you, when the men were on one side and the girls were on the other? Oh no, I had that experience as well. And I can assure you that it's not for the faint-hearted, because if you've had any kind of sensitivities, forget about it. Yeah. You came home to the Olympia a broken woman. Yeah, I know. You know? And you stood there, and like everybody passed you, and I said, I know I shouldn't have worn that dress, or whatever. Well, that's the woman's side of it, and I tell you, because like from the man's side of it, I remember the conversation every Monday morning at the glass factory when I was only young fellows. Well, how many refusals did you get? Isn't it amazing? Yeah. And we would never have thought about it like that. Yeah. And we'd be looking at the men and what do you think of him and him? Yeah. And no matter who you liked, they always went in a different direction. Yeah. Yeah. And you ended up with somebody that you absolutely couldn't stick, or had no personality. But that was great training as well. Oh, you know? Well, you know something, I have a theory about is that the life you spoke of growing up playing beddies on the road, getting that responsibility for your mother with the thing. There was an age that we developed at a normal rate. Now kids are born and the first thing is thrust into their hand to shut them up is a phone or a tablet. Yeah. And there's none of that. There's none of this physical exercise. There's nothing, responsibility or anything for anything. Yeah. And it's politics. Did you vote? Oh, did I vote? I most certainly did. And going back to my childhood, Dermot, my mother was an out Fianna Fáil woman. Okay. And came from a house at the top of Castle Street where they actually hid people, had false floors, false walls, false doors. Yeah. And came from that kind of background where they were dyed-in-the-wool Republicans. Okay. And everything was hush-hush. Because everything was secret at that time, because that was actually living through what our history is today. Exactly. They were all part of it. And so the stories that were passed on to us were passed down from my mother. So I suppose I grew up in a house where the name of De Valera and the Sacred Heart, which was on the wall with the little bulb, you spoke about them with the same level of reverence.
Of course.
My father, on the other hand, was Fine Gael.
Okay.
And as my mother said, well, when we feel like talking to the Redmonites, we will, and that's when they were having a row. So it was very much a mixed marriage. I'm going to tell the blue shirt his dinner is ready.
Yeah.
You know, this kind of stuff. And like when I think back on it, it was actual abuse for us to be put in that situation. But my father didn't. He wasn't as fanatical as she was.
Yeah. And
not only did we vote, but we were told who to vote for.
Now, did it influence your decision at which political party that you voted for?
It did, but I wasn't aware of it then. Yeah. Now, I did go through, as I got older, going through all of the various different ideologies and the different parties, but found myself going back. I still don't know whether I'm kind of going back to the comfort of knowing that that's what I know because it's how I know it, but I still go back and I am Fianna Fáil. And in fact, I am Secretary of the Fianna Fáil Common in Ballymacaw.
Oh, right. Okay, so you're still a Fianna Fáil.
I'm very active,
Oh, that's good. Okay. Religion, right?
Yes.
And I know that's a subject dear to your heart, and I know that you pursued an educational qualification. Now, how often did you go to Mass? When you were young, I'm talking about now, did you?
We went every single Sunday, and we went to the vigil masses, and then obviously the Christmas Day, Easter Sunday, and coming home with the holy water on Easter Sunday. Yeah. And you certainly could not start the week after Easter without the holy water from the font. Yeah. So all of that was was all part of my grounding, I suppose, in religion. When I got to about 13, I suppose, I began to wonder, what's this Mass all about? And if I didn't go to Mass, what difference would it make? And I do remember the first time I didn't go to Mass. Yeah. And there was Josephine Duran and my sister Terry and myself, and we were allowed to go to Mass on our own at that time. Yeah. And we decided we're going down Ballybricken. Yeah. Could we bother? You know, we were going for a walk. Yeah. We went for the walk. Yeah. And I waited all day for something bad to happen to me. For the sky to fall down, you know, or a wall to fall on me, and the doom and gloom, and it didn't. Yeah. And I always remember thinking, did somebody lie? Was it all a joke, or what was it all about? So I think from that point I began to question, is the word, I suppose. Yeah. What was it all about? Yeah. But then, of course, went through the normal teenage years and married life. But there was always something inside me that made me question the reality of a presence. Yeah. Because sometimes I would feel a presence. Now, I didn't know if I imagined it. Yeah. The notion of having saints, did they exist or didn't they? The St. Anthony ritual, if you lost something and it was found, was that real? Yeah. Was that a kind of a superstition? Yeah. I was never quite sure, but I was absolutely sure that there was something in my life that had saved me at times when there wasn't anything else. Yeah. There were times in my life when I felt I should have, I suppose, been in the depths of depression or the depths of awfulness, and I didn't know what it was. And I suppose I'm lucky in the sense that the opportunity came my way, but sort of hard won, and that was, as I said, when I separated. Yeah. And I had 4 children, and it was a very, very hard time. It was a hard time economically, and I had never known poverty, ever, until then. So that was a whole new way.
Rita, at some stage you decided to re-enter education. Could you tell us about your second chance at education?
Well, as I said, Dermot, all of the experiences that I was having at that time actually compounded the fact for me that I was in the wrong place in my life at that time. But the only way for me to actually, I suppose, nail down who I was, what I was and where I wanted to go was to go back and go into 3rd level education. But I was also aware that the cost of that was way outside of the resources that I had at that time. But I put it there in my head, and I thought, this is what I need to do. Whether I do it today, whether I do it next month, next year, this is my goal, and this is where I have to go. And I also realised that in terms of a legacy, I needed to leave a legacy for my children. That was never going to be in gold and silver and jewels. That was never going to happen. But I had to leave a legacy of some sort. And it was at that point in my life that I actually realised that we create our own legacies. We are totally in charge of what we leave behind us. But having said all that, I became aware of, I was doing a little bit of research here and there to see where I could find my way back. What were the avenues that were there? Where could I find that stepping stone? And I discovered that if I did a FOS course, it would be the very first step. That was very enlightening for me, because I met other women who are probably on the same journey, but we're all going in different directions.
I think that's the key in lots and lots of cases. You meet kind of a kindred spirit or something.
Absolutely.
A common experience.
Yes.
And you can move from there.
Yeah, and actually I realised that we were like pilgrims on a pilgrimage, but all going there for a different reason, for our own aspiration and our own goals. But on that course, I met Anne Jordan. She came one morning to give us a talk. Anne was the lecturer in philosophy in WIT. And I mean, as soon as I heard her, I said, I want to do this, because I'm a thinker. And if I could make sense of how I think and what I think, I can make sense of my world, not the entire world. So I spoke to Anne, and she said, yeah, you should come and start in September. Again, finances were out of the question. But Vinnie Martin got me a grant. And so I did my philosophy. Now, during the course of that philosophy course, I was doing a module called Faith in the Existence of God. And I actually found, I just fell into it like a duck into water. And actually I began to realise that the mysteries that we had been taught in our catechism and our catechesis all along, for me, was absolutely no mystery whatsoever. And I began to realise that the whole issue was an issue of faith. Now, I wasn't able to verbalise it at the time because I didn't have that kind of language. But however, when my results came out, those were my highest points. And I was advised to go on and do something in the area of studying theology. Now, studying theology for me was completely out of the question, because I knew the only faculties where that could be done was in Trinity or in St. John's College, or some of the seminaries, which of course did not accept women. So again, it was something that I shelved and said, right, maybe at some point in my life I might find a way to do this. But it's interesting, because I think when you make those decisions, that you actually find a way unconsciously to get there. So I became aware, a friend of mine told me that at that point she had read somewhere that Vatican II was being implemented. I knew very little about Vatican II at the time, so I began to read up on it. And in order to comply with the conditions of Vatican II, these seminaries had to open up their pontifical degrees to lay people, which included women. For me, this was an absolute breath of fresh air, and I couldn't wait to find out. I mean, I thought, gosh, this must be too good to be true, because only 2 months ago I was saying, you know, I must put this on the back burner for maybe a couple of years, or my youngest child, Claire, was only 5 at the time, and I thought maybe when she's about 10. And for this to come out of the blue was, I suppose, what I look back on and now see as a kind of a miracle. So I remember taking Claire by the hand and walking up to St. John's College, not knowing what I was going to say, how I was going to say it, how I was going to get around the issue of finance or payments, but I just knew deep inside I had to do this. I'm walking in and walking along the avenue and ringing the doorbell, and it was answered by a nun, and I thought, oh dear, I thought there were priests there. But however, I asked anyway for, as I thought, maybe the director. So I was brought in and I was introduced to Father Michael Mullins, and I told him my story, and I said, look, I want to do theology. I want to do a degree in theology. And the question he asked me was, who sent you here? I said, I think it might be God. And he decided anyway that we couldn't argue with that, but we would take it from there. And so it was put in motion that I would start on the 4th of September This was actually the 2nd of July. It's a sort of a hallmark date in my life that I now look back on and know that at that point my whole life changed. So I started on the 4th of September with nothing but an A4 pad and a barrow. And I thought, you know, I'll manage somehow. And interestingly, my very first lecture was scripture. And I was absolutely so happy. And I remember knowing that I had been there before. This wasn't new to me. And I don't know why and I don't know how. But I knew exactly what was being said. And after that lecture, one of the students came to me and he said, "Do you have a Bible?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, look, I've been given a gift of the New Jerusalem Bible. I already have two. And would you be offended if I gave it to you?" And I said, "Absolutely not." Within an hour, I had the Code of Canon Law. I had every single book that was needed for that year. So I understand perfectly what miracles are. They're not things that blow up in the sky. They're not huge, amazing dramas in our lives. They're actually the smallest things that actually change our course of direction when you see them. But when you study theology, it's a journey, it's a reflective journey, it's highly academic because you look at it philosophically, theologically, you put the strands together, but then the strands all go back to you because according to Anselm, St. Anselm, theology is faith seeking understanding. But you can't seek to understand your faith unless you also seek to articulate it, and that's the most important thing. And when I realised that, I knew why I was there. And I understood the articulation of the scriptures and God's articulation in the incarnation. In the Old Testament you have this Elohim, Bara Bereshit, Elohim, the opening text of the Hebrew Bible. In the beginning was God, and this Elohim was the majestic God, the unapproachable God, the God of might and power, the God who commanded the world to be, for light to be, for water, for energy, all of the things that made the world function. And then in the New Testament you have the incarnation, you have the God who commands love. And it's only love that makes the world function, and it's only through the word that we understand the actual act of creation. And I know it's difficult for me to put it into words, but for me it just all flows right from one into the other. And I can pick pieces from scripture now, and I find myself that I am actually very privileged to be able to do that, and to pick a piece from scripture, to read it and to actually understand, even though it was placed in a completely different time, in a different culture, and maybe for different reasons at the time. But I understand perfectly what it means to me at that moment in my life and what to do next. But in 1995 I graduated, and there were a couple of firsts. Actually, I was the first woman in the history of St. John's College to come through the hallowed halls of that building, and particularly to come through with a Pontifical Degree in Theology. I was the first woman in the history of the amalgamated Universities of Ireland to come through with a Pontifical Degree.
Can you explain what a Pontifical Degree is? Really?
It's a degree which is from the Vatican. It's a BA in Theology, and it's exactly the same degree as our priests and our bishops have. Whereas if you study theology as an NUI subject like the national universities, you have a Bachelor of Divinity, which is quite different. It's not any less valuable or any less informative, but it doesn't entitle you to be a church theologian. I suppose that's the difference.
It doesn't, despite having exactly the same knowledge.
Very same knowledge, because if you haven't studied it in a seminary, it's deemed to not have been done through the annals of the church.
Okay. Your time in St. John's, I mean, it's fascinating to think that, you know, that did you find yourself a woman in a male situation, or were you treated as an equal?
In the beginning, it's interesting you asked that question, because even though these were all men and various ages and various backgrounds, they all had a different view of life. For some of them, the way they dealt with me was, Asher, that's Rita the feminist, because I would always ask a question. I always had to have something clarified, and I didn't see the point in being there if I didn't use every single opportunity. And besides the fact that that it was being paid for by the diocese, this was something I found in canon law, so I no longer had to worry about funds or funding, which is another miracle. But the others, various relationships, but an absolutely wonderful relationship with all of them.
Good.
Nobody resented the fact that I was there, and I no longer saw myself as just a woman in a man's place. I saw myself in a place where I deserved to be.
Well, isn't that the tragedy of women not being allowed to go further in the ministry of the Church, of the Roman Catholic Church? If you know what I mean. Now, I don't even know what your opinion of it is, but for me, I think it's a tragedy that somebody with your talent, with your obvious love for the subject, had to go to a certain point and, like Moses, look down on the promised land but couldn't go there.
Yeah, and that's another good question, because that's a question I asked myself. If I were a man, would I be doing this purely to be ordained, purely to be in the priesthood? Now, I did realise very quickly that my ministry was where I was with my family and in the world that I found myself in. So I was able to reconcile that. But the broader issue of women not being a central and integral part of the church is not simply a tragedy, it's actually a sin. Because if you consider the God of love, how can you say this God of love is discriminatory in any way? And that because the 12 apostles were men, therefore there's no indication that Jesus would have invited a woman. And how you can say that when many of the women apostles were the ones who led the church and led the revolution.
Well, like in early church history, you'll actually find women, the deaconess. Now, for me, a deaconess is the same as somebody calling somebody an apprentice. There's an object, there's a destination in mind, and that destination, an apprentice plumber will eventually be a plumber.
That's right.
So a deaconess will actually eventually become a minister, a fully fledged minister.
Yes.
That seems to be, don't like to talk about that part, if you know what I mean. So
it's never going to be talked about, Dermot, because in order to talk about it, you have to look at all of the wider issues. I was at the launch of Laudate Si, which is the latest encyclical, papal encyclical, which has to do with the earth and how we must love the earth. And I had absolutely no problem standing up and saying, how can we possibly love the earth when we're not allowed to love each other? When we're not allowed to see each other as equals, that even in this room, there are people who have access to a situation called the church, and there are people like me who will never have access, and we are being asked together to love the earth.
Yeah. The
earth was there for us to be stewards of together as humans, not as men, not as women, not as priests, but as humans. And it wasn't put there for our ownership, for our stewardship.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that Sean McDonough actually was the facilitator for that on that night. And his book, when I was going to Trinity to do ecofeminism, The Greening of the Church, was my Bible. And yet, here we had this very same author never once mentioned the great ecofeminists who have given so much towards what is now being the renovation or the reclamation of the earth, all being done through women understanding how the earth has been plundered and raped and how it must come back and be brought back in a way that is wholesome and holistic to all of us as men and women.
Rita, just listening to you there, I think it's a great tragedy that you cannot have a format and that actually get paid at that, to dispense that knowledge that you've accumulated, acquired, and the passion, because an awful lot of teachers are not passionate about the subject. It's a career, and in all walks of life you have careerists They don't have, as you call it in Mount Sinai, they say the glow, that big, deep love and passion, which you obviously have for your subject. Rita, you spoke about Vatican II, Pope John the 23rd. I know briefly we spoke about another earlier stage. What do you think actually happened there? There was no fulfilment of John the 23rd's dream.
And in my humble opinion, I would say he is probably one of the greatest popes that ever graced the Catholic Church. And his ambition and his reasoning for Vatican II was to give the Church back. It was about the royal priesthood. The laity were to be known as the royal priesthood, who actually were the stewards of the Church, and that those within the Catholic Church were merely servants of the royal priesthood. So he was actually turning the Church completely on its own head.
Yeah. And
that's where we began to get the vernacular, the Mass in our own language, and the priest facing the congregation, rather than this compounding the mystery of standing before the tabernacle with the back towards the congregation and people wondering, what really was happening, and the whole notion and the miracle, I suppose, or the belief in the transubstantiation was kept between the priest and the tabernacle. The host was never a part of the congregation.
I don't know if I asked this question previously. Stop me if I did. Did I ask you about, has all this outing of the Catholic Church now in terms of this sexual abuse of children and that, and in the church, has that affected you, your faith in any way? Or not your faith, I wouldn't say your faith, but your belief in the Catholic Church?
Well, first of all, Dermot, the Catholic Church is a religion. And a religion is merely the vehicle or the vessel through which, or the platform through which you practice your faith. For me, I learned how to understand my faith, what my faith was about, so I didn't need a place to go to practice it. Now, my choice not to be, I suppose, an active part or an active participant in the daily or the weekly ongoings of the church has nothing to do with my faith. I mean, I will go to Mass, I will go to funerals, I will go to weddings. It doesn't diminish me, it doesn't diminish my faith. My faith is separate. And what has happened in the church has broken people's belief in the religion, which is good.
Very good point.
And people now have to wonder and work out, what is my religion about? And maybe finally, or eventually find their way to understanding its faith. Faith is the journey. Religion is like the place, like the Mecca, where you go to make your submissions to God. Like the temple in the Old Testament, where you brought your sins to the high priest, and then he went behind the veil, and he delivered your sins to God, and then he came back through the veil, and he told you that your sins were forgiven, or perhaps maybe not. Yeah. But there was very little difference between that and as we're going to a confession box. What is the difference except they turned it into a sacrament? Yeah. And it's interesting that if you look at the whole Reformation, our scriptures went to the Protestant side and the sacraments stayed on the Catholic side. So our knowledge of our scriptures was actually robbed and taken from us. The only access we had to scripture was the readings at Mass on a Sunday, which meant very little. They had no meaning at a personal level, but the whole issue was around sacrament. And so much so that the idea of the sacrament of marriage was a bind instead of the fact that it's a covenant. And we never learned that. But when I began to explore my faith, I realised that all of the duties I had been told, which were put on me in order to please God, I realised actually none of them were important, because what I had with God was a covenant, regardless of how I lived my life or what I did, that my faith in God was never going to save me. It was God's faith in me that would save me.
Rita, I'm mindful of the fact that this is for the future. This is for not this, and its collection of oral histories is for the future, that people can look and see what did real people believe in the 20th century, early 21st century. A lot of those sort of like antique things are now going out. I don't know if there is still church women after birth in the church, but you, with your background in theology, might be able to explain as to why they saw a need to church women and what it exactly, and explain what it was.
It actually came from the Old Testament and from the Jewish tradition that anything to do with blood was offensive to God, and that is why they have their kosher foods, which must have no trace of blood in them whatsoever. Particularly with women, there would be signs if women were menstruating that they couldn't enter the temple. And so it was carried on and carried forward. And when women came out of having given birth, they were obviously, within the first 6 weeks or the following 6 weeks, they would be bleeding. And so therefore, they had to be put at the back of the church where they were, it was almost an incarceration because it was offensive to God. They couldn't deny them the sacrament of being at Mass, but they could tell them where to be.
So they have to be back at the church?
At the back of the church.
It's unbelievable.
It is unbelievable and acceptable. It was acceptable and nobody questioned it. But this is what power is about. You know, this is tyranny.
Yeah.
And when people realise that using God as tyrannical is no different to what we're seeing in Syria or with ISIS, it is exactly the same principle. It's using God as a weapon and ammunition, and nothing whatsoever to do with faith or God's love or the resurrection.
One thing struck me as you were talking about St. John's College, and that was the role of the nuns up at the college. Now, I think most people know that the most common perception is that when you become a nun, you teach in schools, so you go out looking after lepers, so you go out looking after this. But there was a whole underclass in the nunnery. Would I be correct in saying that?
You would.
Those of the poorer people, from the working class mainly, or who wouldn't have a big dowry, that they would never see the inside of the classroom except sweeping it or cleaning it. And that you had, like the nuns in the Good Shepherd, I beg your pardon, in St. John's College, were essentially just cooking and that cleaning.
You see, you have to remember, Dermot, that in every institution there's a hierarchy. And that hierarchy is needed for it to function. So, because you're part of a religious institution, or as the religious, like nuns or Christian brothers, they're like accessories to the church. They help to function at different levels. Even within a convent situation, you'll have nuns who work in the kitchen, as you said, who would have come from different backgrounds, who wouldn't have the same to offer as those who would have come, who would have had a certain education and could pass that on, or who were maybe perhaps bright enough, intelligent enough for the church to educate them in order to educate children. So in St. John's, the only function that I saw there with the nuns was cooking.
Can you remember the name of the order?
Was it the Poor Sisters or something?
Sisters of Jesus or something. I can't
remember.
Somebody told me the name of it before, yeah.
But interestingly, one of my lecturers in spirituality was a nun, Sister Patrick, but she was from a different order. And probably one of the most inspirational women that I have met in my life. She didn't have the same outlook because she had gone outside of, I suppose, the institution, and she had studied in America. And you could see that breaking that institutionalization, what it had done to her, and you can see what not breaking it, what it does to people.
Well, she became a woman.
She became a woman and she became a person.
Yeah, yeah. Rita, you have been an inspiration to me, listen to you, and I know that this video will be an inspiration to other women and show how much they can do.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Anything is possible, Dermot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dermot. Thank you.